Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot for being there, and thanks very much for inviting me to present today. I'm going to share with you my paper, Data, Sense, Resonance, and Art of Diabetic Self-Tracking. But this will be kind of an abridged version of this paper, and I've taken out some of the more theoretically dense aspects, and I'm going to try and focus on a few core ideas around how it is that we relate to bodily data. I'm going to talk especially about diabetes, about my creative project, Hemoresonance #1, and about the concept of data resonance. The aim of this work is to contribute to thinking critically about how we understand relationships between data and bodies, and to think about how the processes and technologies that are used to collect data from bodies can be approached in new ways through artistic practice. Health-related data generated by various self-tracking activities involving tests and wearable sensors are increasingly part of daily life and the way that we understand our bodies. And these data are typically used simultaneously to provide a sort of window into the functioning of the body and as motivation for improving that functioning. What I'm interested in asking here is what else can be done with this data? And I'm using the idea of data resonance as a way of exploring that question, especially in relation to diabetic self-tracking practices. In the longer paper, I draw on a range of theorists and ideas, including work that questions conventional understandings of bodies, like that of Anne-Marie Moll and John Law, and work focusing on self-tracking practices like that of Deborah Lupton. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go very deeply into this during the presentation, but I'd be happy to talk about this stuff afterwards if anyone is interested. What interests me about these theorists is how they ask questions about the relationality and co-corporeality of bodies. And this is important to me because practices of managing diabetes, which include things like blood sugar testing and insulin injection, involve ways of relating with the body that challenge common understandings of body boundaries, like, for instance, the idea that the body ends at the skin. Since the diabetic extracts blood for testing and injects insulin for metabolizing sugar, the work that that kind of used to be carried out in the body by the pancreas, by this organ that seems really to be situated within the body, all that work now weaves in and out of this supposed skin barrier. But this idea of how these diabetic management practices might challenge body boundaries isn't often given very much attention, because diabetic self-management is very focused on achieving target blood sugar results. So data, particularly numbers in the form of these blood glucose test results, are used to measure how well one's been managing their illness and to provide information for acting on it. So I see my blood glucose reading is this, and that means I should eat something, or I should inject this much insulin, or I should go for a run, etc. And in acting on these numbers, I should be able to achieve tighter control and stave off the consequences of uncontrolled diabetes, which include things like nerve damage and kidney failure, loss of consciousness, and even death. So as a diabetic, you're constantly looking for patterns in the data and making adjustments to your behaviors in order to improve test results. But this constant emphasis on diabetic data for control not only places a huge responsibility on the individual, but also has a tendency to shut down other ways of understanding diabetes and the associated practices and possibilities for approaching the body. So I've become really curious about what can be done with bodily data if that goal orientation around body management and improvement is at least temporarily suspended. And to that end, I've been experimenting with the concept that I'm referring to as data resonance. So data resonance focuses on movements and performances of and with data. It's a kind of play on the idea of data visualization, sonifications, but it diverges in that it has no interest in making data legible or interpretable. So instead, data resonance produces visualizations, sonifications, and other manifestations of data, but in ways that aim to detach themselves as much as possible from interpretability and end goals. So trying to follow instead other possible pathways of data and bodies. In the context of my creative project, Hemoresonance number 1, this means trying to open up space for becoming, but not in the sense of becoming better, rather in the sense of continuous liminality, unpredictability, and relationality. And I'm arguing that such spaces are required not simply as psychological salves or therapeutic meditations for the diabetic person who's become distressed in their never-ending search for control, but more broadly as spaces where we continue to ask about the boundaries and configurations of humans and non-humans. Just going to start the video here. here we go. For hemoresonance number 1, I sonified my own data from 100 days of blood sugar testing and insulin injections. And I then made those sonifications tactile, transferring them as physical vibrations to a surface on which the hundreds of test strips used to perform the blood glucose measurements were laid out. Normally, these strips are discarded as biomedical waste, but here the strips they're now animated, given another life by the very data that they helped to produce. So their reactions to the vibrations are video recorded, and subsequently they're processed to produce this mirrored effect, creating the impression of a pattern when in reality the motion of the strips was quite chaotic. This forcing of a pattern relates to the way that a diabetic person is continually looking for patterns in their data, even though that data is often unpredictable and affected by more factors than could ever really reasonably be taken into consideration. The vibrations from the sonified data are also transferred to vibrotactile devices for visitors to touch while they watch the video, so they feel the same vibrations as they see them moving the test strips. And I've done this both using a commercially available device called a H.E.A.R.T and also using a more DIY approach with tactile transducers inserted into cushions. So here, data resonance has to do with both the movement and physicality of data. It's transference between materials and bodies. And it has to do with drawing attention to affective possibilities of data rather than with the ability to make sense of and act on that data for particular goals. Part of the affectivity has to do with the very intimate personal nature of the data. Laura Forlano has talked about diabetes in terms of data rituals, where she's referring to, quote, the quantitative tracking, measurement, and transmission of data, along with phenomenological lived experiences and labor around these practices, end quote. Hemoresonance presents the data from the data rituals that I carry out on a daily basis in order to stay alive. It's drawn from fluids that I extract from and inject into my body that people are now feeling as the data. They're now feeling the data as tactile vibrations. So in using my personal data, I'm purposefully connecting the work into the wider cultural logic of self-tracking, which is invested in bodily experimentation on the level of the single individual and in sharing the results of that experimentation. But again, self-tracking is often driven by the desire for self-improvement and for making data more meaningful and actionable through interpretable visualizations. So what you see here is a screenshot of just a few self-tracking projects on the Quantified Self website. The Quantified Self community is probably the largest and most active group of people sharing their experiments with self-tracking. And it's worth pointing out on the bottom left-hand side of the screen, you can see an example of a non-diabetic tracking their blood glucose levels as well. And this is something that's becoming more common, at least in this community, as the technology becomes more available and less intrusive. But in all these projects, you can really see the emphasis on making sense of this very personal data through visualization. So in this context, a visualization that makes data less legible is generally not regarded as effective. But that's exactly the kind of visualization that I'm offering with hemoresonance. And what I'm attempting to do with data resonance and this reorientation to datification that it involves is to dwell in the relationships that contribute to and are affected by the collection and circulation of data. So in hemoresonance, this means focusing on this weave of shifting and boundary challenging relations that diabetes produces, more than on the test results and the actions that should be taken. So I'd like to leave plenty of space for comments and questions. So I'm going to end there. Thanks.
Playing with Emotions, Biosignal-based Control in Virtual Reality Game Project H.E.A.R.T. Project H.E.A.R.T, Holographic Empathy Attack Robotics Team, is a critical art game in the style of the militainment genre. Project H.E.A.R.T uses a custom biosensing device to gather data from the VR user, using their physiological markers of emotion to affect the performance of a military game. Using this biodata, Project H.E.A.R.T embeds technologies of effective computing and quantified empathy into the algorithmic structures of the game's combat system, using satire and camp as devices for exploring the problematics that undergirds the use of VR and biosensing technologies as entertainment for some and tools of violence for others.
Challenging character tropes. While the militainment genre typically focuses on masculinized, self-righteous soldier characters, the main protagonist in Project H.E.A.R.T, and the player's proxy, is a feminine virtual pop star known as H.E.A.R.T. Haku is well known in otaku culture as an officially recognized derivative of the Vocaloid character Hatsune Miku. A celebrity virtual pop star Vocaloid developed by Japanese company Printemps Media. This merging of feminized and masculinized tropes in the game contradicts gendered expectations in gaming genres, exploring how feminized characters that appeal to emotion can be used as tools of soft power in militainment. In the game, Hatsu appears on the battlefield as a hologram emitted from a Roomba, a household robot which is also a quotidian product of military technology.
This is not what I signed up
for. Morale support of a technologically enhanced super soldier. The core mechanic of gameplay revolves around the moral support of a semi-automated human mech combat team. Although the algorithms in the game ensure that this mech team reliably slaughters their enemies, the team is also regularly hampered by psychological distress, measured through morale. Morale is calculated through a single numerical value, which varies from soldier to soldier according to in-game events and situations. Hitting an opponent slightly increases a soldier's morale, but killing or getting shot decreases their morale. As each soldier experiences mounting psychological stress, he is surrounded by a halo of red color. Team members also regularly vocalize platitudes that represent their state of mind, ranging from euphoria to kind of mid-ground to total despair.
For example,
is destruction an important part of life? My violence is a form of labor. I hate this game, and I resent you for playing it.
So while the first two examples were kind of a medium valence, questioning kind of philosophical state of mind, the last one represents a more dire psychological state of mind for the soldier character. There are also higher valence statements such as, for the future, at any cost, or if I die, it's because I didn't try hard enough. A soldier's morale is further influenced by the morale of their peers in their vicinity, representing the effect of group morale. When an individual soldier's morale reaches 0, the soldier is traumatized and cannot act anymore in the game. The morale system is tuned to make the soldiers lose morale over time, and thus be unable to participate in the battle. However, the game provides a mechanism to tilt things in the favor of the player's team through the interventions of virtual pop star Yamane Haku as she moves automatically across the battlefield to get closest to the soldiers with the lowest morale. The player is instructed to passively observe this battle while placing their fingers on a biosensing unit, providing physiological evidence of their encouragement or enthusiasm. When the player's skin conductance surpasses a predefined threshold, the system labels this event as sufficiently indicative of enthusiasm And this rise in enthusiasm illuminates an LED on the game's external sensor system and triggers a power-up for the player's military team in the form of a short song emitted from Yomane Haku that boosts their morale. So when this happens, the friendly soldiers in the vicinity experience a significant increase in morale, allowing them to continue the fight, and you can hear the pop star vocalizing in the game and musical notes appear over her head. If the user does not sufficiently provide physiological evidence of their excitement to the biosensing technologies of Project H.E.A.R.T, eventually all the robot soldiers suffer from emotional breakdown and ceasefire. In summary, the core game mechanics of Project H.E.A.R.T rest on an artificial ecosystem where morale is a resource that gets depleted over time, but can be replenished by the player's indirect control over the main character via their physiological markers of emotional engagement. So, does biosensing detect emotional engagement? In emotional physiology, one of the most basic measures of emotional engagement is measured through skin conductance sensing. The signal is robust and easy to interpret because rises in the skin conductance signal are reliably correlated to emotionally engaging stimuli and stress. However, these rises in skin conductance also say nothing of whether this engagement is positive or negative in valence. The potential for this signal to be misinterpreted by the technology is instrumentalized through Project H.E.A.R.T's campy aesthetic and in-game references of the platitudes of the soldier characters to sincerity, empathy, optimism, and self-help. The advantage of using this simple but indirect method of control is that it permits the player to experiment with their psychological state in a very simple way in order to cheer on their team. For example, some people, they kind of actively try to imagine themselves in a very happy place, or they kind of tense up in order to get themselves kind of internally excited, to kind of trigger their enthusiasm with the correct places. Other people kind of look for physical cheats to cheat the system, so they kind of wiggle their fingers around, or they kind of try to sweat or something like this by moving around really fast. So complementing this physiological mechanic, the cardiac activity of the viewer is also obtained through our sensor system and filtered over a window of time. When cardiac activity indicates higher levels of arousal, this increases the area of effect for Haku's power-up song, allowing her encouragement to reach even more of the player soldier's team. In general, whether the enthusiasm of the player is sincere or not, this is kind of one of the ongoing dialogues in the game.
Discoveries. VR user responses. During the non-interactive introductory portion of the work, the biosensors commonly detect increased levels of arousal at specific moments, giving the artists concrete physiological feedback about how their pre-rendered work impacts viewers. First, there is a notable rise in skin conductance when Yomane Haku dramatically enters on screen, confirming the affective resonance of this moment. This happens again when the viewer is presented to the battlefield at what's commonly known in the gaming community as dog's eye view, which drops into first-person perspective. In freefall, virtual reality and vertical perspective. Verticality is a visual maneuver which repeats itself in various stages within the gameplay of Project H.E.A.R.T. The intro sequence has a moment in which the verticality of the user is heightened by the lack of a ground plane. This serves to create variability in the player's biodata, eliciting a physiological or emotional response to the verticality, preparing the sensor calibration for later gameplay. The movement of the camera in the VR game itself predicts the player's influence on this environment that they are thrust into, a technologically mediated superposition that is simultaneously once removed, smooth, and immune from physical harm. At the end of the game, the user is presented with a high score that quantifies their emotional performance within the paradigm of the game, how their effect either protected their own team from trauma or facilitated further violence against their enemies. This high score is itself ambiguous in its own meaning. The player is given no information whether these numbers are to be taken as victory or defeat. This high score panel is intended to highlight the inhumanity of the technological quantification when one compares trauma of one soldier to the death of many enemy soldiers. These numbers present a space for critical reflection on the purpose of the game, such as how is a player as an emotional body complicit in the technologies of inhumane violence via militainment? How does the technological infrastructure itself coax physiological and affective responses from the viewer, however insincere or misinterpreted by the algorithm? What does winning this game ultimately mean? We leave it for the player to interpret, to come to terms with on your own.
Hi, my name is Renata Azevedo Moreira. I am a PhD candidate in communication studies at Université de Montréal, and I'm here to present my article, Beyond the Turn and Toward the Event, the curatorial as a material-discursive practice. In his famous text, The Curatorial Turn from Practice to Discourse, Paul O'Neill identified signs of a transition which had been happening since the beginning of the 90s. For him, the activity of curating is more than selecting artworks, building connections between them, or looking after a collection. The most important function of a curator is to elaborate a cohesive discourse, and in doing so, become the author of a larger artwork, which would most of the times take the shape of an art exhibition. This is the opinion of Paul O'Neill. For centuries now, the humanities have been focusing on creating and analyzing discourses in order to produce knowledge. In his work, Production of Presence, What Meaning Cannot Convey, Hans Ulrich Gumbrecht reflects on the historical hierarchical privilege of comprehension when compared to perception. On his conceptualization of the aesthetic experience, he claims that there should be a balance between meaning effects and presence effects, the latter being identified as everything that, and I quote, exclusively appeal to the senses, end quote. Hans Gumbrecht considered that enabling this kind of experience, which is one of the many potential outcomes of the curatorial gesture, does not equal to helping the public find out the possible discursive significations that would hide behind the material artworks. It has just as much to do with understanding as it has with feeling. With that idea in mind, he suggests the following provocation, and I quote, "Whenever conveying or exemplifying an ethical message is supposed to be the main function of a work of art, we need to ask, and indeed the question cannot be eliminated, whether it would not be more efficient to articulate that same ethical message in rather straightforward and explicit concepts and forms." Adapting this reflection to the curatorial work, we should acknowledge that if the role of a curator was solely to attribute meaning or to create cohesive discourses, she wouldn't need to elaborate or think about original and innovative curatorial gestures and strategies. There would be no room for the whole domain of curatorial studies, since curatorial work would not be capable of developing knowledge or engendering artfulness. We could then ask ourselves now, what can the curatorial do? Is it done exclusively through the result of the exhibition? What role play the practices constituting the curatorial for the creation of knowledge from an emerging initial idea to its final public event? Similarly to what happened to the notion of curatorial, the definition of the word sentience has also shifted throughout time, but in this case more cohesively with current post-structuralist views. As well described in this call for projects, in the 1600s, its Latin origins, sentientem, meant capable of feeling. On the 1800s, though, according to the online etymology dictionary, the word's most common use became closer to that of consciousness or of being conscious of something. If we opt to focus on the process of correspondence between terms, this demonstrates an important approximation or a relative reduction of the classical barrier between interpretation and feeling. Every act of interpretation would require an act of conscious reflection, which in its turn could not be parted from the feeling emerging through it. In the very conceptual transition of the word sentience could reside the key to detaching the curatorial work from the strictly discursive duty it has been charged with since O'Neill's curatorial turn. In the article, Posthumanist Performativity Toward an Understanding of How Matter Comes to Matter, published in 2003, and now an important canon of the new materialisms, Karen Barad starts from Foucault to explain why we should no longer use only language, representation, and discourse to analyze the world. When defending the need to include the material in this equation, she says, and I quote, Foucault's analytic of power links discursive practices to the materiality of the body. However, his account is constrained by several important factors that severely limit the potential of his analysis and Butler's performative elaboration, thereby foretelling an understanding of precisely how discursive practices produce material bodies. The how is a fundamental part of the curatorial. It is only through a series of curatorial choices that a public curatorial event, which we could associate here to what Barad calls the material body, can take place. The how includes a string of practices that have recently been identified as belonging to the realm of curating. According to Beatrice von Bismarck, curating involves a set of practices and activities that allow the curatorial event to take place. These techniques are usually centered on the figure of the curator and on the construction of the public curatorial event. They set the tone of the event, delimiting it and circumscribing it in a particular framework. The curatorial, on the other hand, is focused on the process and specifically on the unpredictable phenomena inside the event, which also has its own sets of agencies. As Erin Rogoff states, and I quote, in the curatorial, the emphasis is on the trajectory of an ongoing active work, not an isolated end product, but a blip along the line of an ongoing project, end quote. Therefore, the curatorial emerges from within curating it in procedures, gaps, and momentums performed by curatorial practices and by their actors, human and other than human. It is only through the analysis of these practices, which are at the same time discursive and material, that we can access the curatorial. The material phenomena that constitute an exhibition or any other curatorial event is also discursive because they frame what is shown and said within them. Borrowing Barad's concept of interaction, we can envisage a relational ontology where not only the material artworks and artifices define the exhibition, but also the exhibition defines the artworks and everything else that is a part of it. For Barad, and I quote, reality is not composed by things in themselves or things behind phenomena, but things in phenomena, end quote. Hence, reality can only be grasped, observed, and experienced from within a specific event. As a material discursive practice, where matter and meaning emerge together and never in the absence of the other, the curatorial englobes not only the processual practices leading up to the exhibition, but also the artists, the artworks, the audience, as well as the gallery space, its scenery, its location, so far, so on. All of that matters, and knowledge can emerge from the specific interactions happening at any point along their line. In Barad's account, discursive practices are material remodelings of the world and its becoming. This is what the curatorial does. It rethinks, reenacts, reconfigures, and reestablishes the world through a series of practices. It is only by taking the practices under consideration that we can access the discourse, for practices do produce discourses and vice versa. These practices include emotions, feelings, mistakes, misconceptions, and many other uncontrollable, irregular, and erratic events performed by different entities. The curatorial, as a material discursive practice, brings sentience to its core, as it does not isolate or hierarchize discourse. Discourse does not prior practice, neither does it determine it, nor is it more important than it. On the contrary, their relations allow for the existence of each other. We could conclude that understanding the curatorial as a performance sentient practice disturbs what is usually expected of it. The curatorial transforms, makes, and creates. It changes artworks, spaces, and people. It brings out of the shadow elements that wouldn't normally be on stage. It makes them protagonists. The curatorial is not necessarily a storytelling, an effort of representation, or an elaborate apparatus to support sense-making. The curatorial does things, and in doing them, it generates new forms of experience. Curation becomes creation not only by establishing a competition within the artist, not at all by establishing a competition with the artist or artworks exhibited, or by stating that the exhibition is a bigger work than the works themselves. It does so by putting all of those elements in relation and waiting to see what happens. That is the main power of the curatorial. It carefully enables all kinds of things to emerge out of submersion, and from that moment on, they become something else. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Aisling Kelliher, and I'm going to talk today about my short paper, Reclaiming and Commemorating Difficult Felt Experiences. So the types of things I'm interested in reclaiming from my experiences are not only the time and the investment of time that I went through, but also kind of the emotional impact of these experiences and what they had for me. And so what I'm essentially talking about is this 5-year process that I went through of engaging with fertility treatments. And I was incredibly privileged and lucky that I was able to have good health insurance and the opportunities and flexibility to participate in this. But I also wanted to acknowledge and look back on and think about some of the hard parts of that experience and how they relate more broadly to the world of technology that we're embedded in. And in particular, I was curious about this notion of solutionism, which has really been brought to the fore by writer and critic Evgeny Morozov. And he's really taken it on to really, quite vociferously challenge the Silicon Valley kind of idea that no matter how complex the social ill that we might come across, there's nothing that an app or a sensor or device can't come across. And as I write in the paper, we talk about that this type of idea of solutionism is looking at all of these problems. If you just throw enough recording devices at it and enough data analytics, and enough number crunching and awesome algorithms, that you'll be able to solve all these problems without necessarily encountering anything like the sparsity of data or the faultiness of data collection or the inherent bias that comes into the development of algorithms. And so what we've seen in this solutionism approach is really evident in the idea of personal optimization or self-actualization, which we've been doing for hundreds of years. Even Jay Gatsby in The Great Gatsby was at this with his daily schedule. But what you're looking at now, and more recently in the last 15 years or so, is the huge growth in consumer products that are being developed to support people become better, which lends themselves the idea like, well, then they're saying that, well, there was something wrong with you to begin with. And we see this not only in health and wellness, but now broadly more speaking, you see these devices growing out further and further as corporate entities look for new markets for these things. And so this digital tracking, which we might have thought initially was like pedometers or looking at how fast you were going on your bike, have really moved into the health and wellness market, and probably in the last decade or so have really begun looking at women's health or the health of transgender people or non-binary people. So if we take a look at some of these digital tracking devices that are out there, you can see some. Here they are within this particular health domain. There are apps and devices that allow you to track your period, to look at things like when you're going to be fertile and when it's lucky enough to have a baby, and you can track everything from in utero all the way up till whenever. You don't have to stop tracking them. So this is type of kind of baby focused surveillance. There's a couple of complex things to pull out here. There's definitely this sense of the objectification of the body as just this kind of numerical deriving entity devoid of any emotion or feeling that is then going to being sent to for-profit organizations. And the asymmetry here between the user-generated data machine, which is yourself, and what that data is being used for by these companies is quite complex. And also there's a lot of complicated socio-technical and cultural issues embedded in this. The sense that, are you being irresponsible if you don't use these? Or are you less than if you're not using these types of self-optimization technologies, without necessarily taking into consideration the financial impedance of this, the educational requirements, and also the idea of whether people have even access to healthcare providers at all, either to help interpret that data or just even more broadly. So in my case, I was thinking as I went through many years of fertility treatment and did use these spreadsheets and that I would like to take a different tack. I want to reclaim that experience and focus more on the kind of a personal way of expressing it that is beyond spreadsheets and beyond all the other types of kind of numerical data collection I was going through. And in my case, I wanted to reframe it as something to commemorate and memorialize. And what could that be? I wanted to create a mattering artifact that would embody the things that were, after many years of reflection, most significant to me from that time. And so, you know, I wanted to come up with a medal, essentially, is what I began to think about, first of all. So I look at all my colleagues who are wonderful, they're out running triathlons and Tough Mudders and all these types of things, and they get these like awesome medals. And then if you go on to, like, say something like Pinterest, you can see, wow, there's also these wonderful ways that you can display them that demonstrate your resilience and your grit and your ability to endure something really, really challenging. And that's wonderful and something to be commended. But I began to think, maybe I want one of those too. And then I was reminded from a book I was reading by Frank Vertosich, which is all about the history of pain, the natural, and why we hurt. And one of the chapters looks at previous civilizations, and in this case, the Aztec civilization in Mexico. And here, women who died during childbirth were buried in full military honors. And also there was, in Aztec myth, there was this character, the Cihuatatea, who is represented there in the stone sculpture. This is something that embodied the warrior spirit of this woman. So I wasn't necessarily thinking of equating what I had gone through with either the ability to, run many, many miles and jump on a bike and cycle, which I obviously cannot do, or the idea of being a warrior. But there was something in there that spoke to me about commemorating and creating a mattering artifact that related to not the numerical data. I mean, I began by tabulating all that, but I lost interest in that and really wanted to look at, well, what was significant to me about this experience? And so I decided to put together this and manufacture my own medal and really just focus on three main aspects of this assisted fertility treatment I went through. So the first one was the medical diagnoses, which, as you can see embossed on the physical medal there, is advanced maternal age in multigravida, which initially really irritated me. Every time I would go to the hospital or the clinic, they would tell me that because of my advanced age, I would have to do this process. I'm like, yeah, I know how old I am, but it has nothing necessarily to do with this current state of my body or my health. But I had to kind of keep going through this. Now, as I think back on it many years later, I'm like, actually, that's kind of cool. Yes, I'm an old lady who, got through it and managed to do it. The other thing that was significant to me is because of my rural location, I had to travel a 300-mile round trip to get to the fertility center itself. And this was over the Appalachian Mountains back and forth. It was quite a lonely process doing that. And over many years, I racked up about 20,000 miles. And I wanted that to be part of it as well. And so here you see these kind of cartographic roadway routes that are embedded within the medal itself, showing and depicting this kind of 150 miles to and fro distance traveled. And I'm just looking at two cycles here, two that kind of stood out to me most significantly, and they're represented slightly differently on the Z-axis. The one that's a little bit further down represents one of the most emotionally kind of devastating journeys, where after many months of preparation, had gone out to complete the final part of the cycle, and it had to be aborted and we weren't able to do it. And driving back was extremely sad and anxiety filling and just a very, very complicated time. The road route to and fro that are higher up in the z-axis represent what we were fortunate enough to have a much more successful experience. Now the railways are made up with the minutiae of the everyday, going through this, the syringes and the needles that you kind of have to hide and use and dispose of, that you encounter every single day, or many, many days over the course of years. And so for me, coming up with this medal, while I was throwing away all the paperwork and deleting all the spreadsheets and getting rid of all the detritus that was left from this experience several years prior, I was like, actually, I think I want to like hold on to that. That was something that I did that I wasn't even sure I would be able to do when I got through it. So what do I do with it now that I've created it? There's different things. So you can wear it, as you can see in the selfie in the middle. I could also, you can put it away, squirrel it away in your important documents drawer, or leave it out on the side of your bureau with other things that are meaningful to you. I'm not suggesting that other people should in any way, or we should start mass manufacturing these, but to me, it was a way of creating something meaningful from a painful experience that was also very invisible. It was something that I didn't talk about with anyone outside of my immediate family, or talk about with people at my institution, or even more broadly over the many, many years that you go through this. And so what really this boils down to is this is a way to kind of resist that solutionist, you're a broken body, you need to be fixed by technology and science, and in a way to reshape it and say, yes, that is true, I had to go through that, but this, I'd like to acknowledge the hardness of that event and represent it in a way that I can live with and reckon with now today, and kind of can look back with it, not necessarily with pride, but at least with a certain sense of deep satisfaction. Thank you for your time, and if you have any other questions, I'd welcome them.
Thanks for that, guys. That was amazing to hear a lot of that in your discussions. We're going to open it up for questions. One came in for Erin from, can you guys hear me okay, hopefully? Ben Bogart. He says, what do you think about biosensors embedded in day-to-day life, perhaps GSR in mouse pads and trackpads that mark computational actions with a sense of arousal? Would this be good or a bad thing for tweets, emails, etc., being tagged with some sense of emotional arousal?
but thank you for your question. I think that there are various ways that our emotion can be tracked and already is tracked. I think that actually there are kind of, even though there isn't GSR sensors, being galvanic skin sensing, also known as skin conductance, which is just like to the layperson, when one becomes emotional, a really robust method of tracking that is through like something that just measures how conductive your skin is on the pads of your fingers typically. I mean, I know that there is kind of this, like, I don't know if we should say like this practice that must have been like backed, saying about attention and how fast you're scrolling and how fast you're moving your mouse and where your mouse goes on the screen. Like these things are already tracked by data collection services. So I think that if GSR was actually in our mouses, I mean, it would be more of the same, really. But I mean, would it be a good thing? I don't think so. I think the less that the internet knows about us, the better, because delivering, it would just be used to deliver you similarity of content and shove us farther and farther down like a rabbit hole of ourselves, which is, I don't know. I like a little randomness now and then.
There's a whole history to this. I know Aisling knows about this through the Media Lab, Rosalind Picard's effective computing work, for instance, where they're embedding sensors into face and other types of interactions with computers. I mean, I think ultimately it changes your perception of it, how you use it, and you just notice it more, right, when you're using it. Same with the sensors, I guess, in the games. But that was an interesting question. And let's see. I think this is to Renata from Ben. I think all practices are mattering for Barad. So what makes curatorial practices different than other practices of mattering? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, I'm having a hard time on, you're cutting it a little bit to me. Can you repeat that, please?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, yeah. So he says, I think all practices are mattering for Barad, who you were speaking of. So what makes curatorial practices different than other practices of mattering?
Well, I think every practice has its specificities, right? Of course, but I think that what is interesting about the curatorial practice as being considered as a practice, and I talk about that from the famous curatorial turn, where O'Neill wanted to promote the curatorial work from practice to discourse. So it was a hierarchization that still goes on until today, where people think that the curatorial work is about producing discourse, is about producing, translating artworks and being able to facilitate an encounter between an artwork and the visitor, for instance, through the production and the facilitation of interpretation and meaning. And I think that what is interesting about the evolution of the concept of sentience, if I think about it, as I said, and the similarities between feeling and understanding, is that in the curatorial work, you can put that into practice throughout the whole process of creating an exhibition or whatever curatorial event it is. So the curator doesn't even have to exist. I mean, all of the artists that presented their works here today, I know that Sam created an exhibition, so the curatorial work can be done by anyone, and it is a practice. It is a set of practices and skills that produce knowledge too. So it's not just the creation of discourse or decodification of artworks, but is a set of practices that create, that also engage public and all of the elements of the process in the production of knowledge. And I think that is what is interesting, because it's a break. It's kind of interruption of the line of thought that we currently have, that curating equals discourse. Yeah.
Yeah, super interesting for sure. Actually, you mentioned Sam. I had a question for him related to data. So I work a lot with data in my own work, but I'm thinking you were mentioning sound as a physical vibration, so turning something auditory into something physical. I was just wondering, when you mix, or when you're putting the sound through so many different filters, or sorry, the data through so many different filters, what does that actually do to the data? Does the data get lost? Does the meaning of it get lost? I was wondering if that question has come up in your work. I see that question come up a lot when I'm talking about this kind of thing.
Sure. Yeah, you can all hear me, right?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, well, interestingly, in my case, I kind of had no problem with the data getting lost, so to speak.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, there was a pretty simple kind of sonification of the data, which actually didn't really disrupt it any more than probably any other sonification, which was taking the numbers and making them pitches and making them just sine waves in a kind of bass frequency, so that would have a lot of kind of more resonance or vibration when I then kind of put the speaker on a cardboard box. But in some sense, really what I was interested in is this process of putting all these different filters and transformations on the data, and the way that certain things would be amplified and attenuated through those processes, and then how something would kind of come out of that data that's different from what you began with, but there's still some kind of connection, and then it kind of raises the question of, yeah, what is that connection if we're saying this is a sonification or a visualization, or in this case, a resonance of data? What's the connection between what you began with and what you end up with? But as I said, again, for me, for this project, it was really trying to move away from that kind of that very widespread desire to maintain a legibility of the data and actually just kind of see what happens without that focus.
Yeah. I don't know if any of the other speakers have something to add to that. But yeah, Erin, maybe. Go ahead.
Not really.
Okay.
To add to how sonification changes the. Sorry, can you repeat the question?
My question was just about, like, when you apply so many filters to data, does the data get lost? That's all. Mainly, you know, in this case, it's sonified.
It depends on what you want to highlight. I mean,
yeah, okay.
There you can.
Because you guys do that in some ways. You have like biosensing.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that like we're not always using the literal data because, for instance, for the heart rate, I mean, it's meaningless by itself. People, like a child, will have a different base heart rate than an adult, and so what we track is actually how the heart rate changes and evolves. So we're kind of trying to, I mean, the way that you filter data makes it more meaningful to a certain application. And I think that in the same way, Sam is filtering the data in a way that makes the most sense to his application. And so I think that's something that's really important with these biometric practices, is just to kind of somehow make this more plain to a lay audience, is that there is no transparency in this data. I think that there's this mythology that as soon as you're working with data, that, you know, you have these BuzzFeed like articles that are like, finally someone showed us what the sun sounds like, and it's like, no, they put it through their filters to express themselves. It's more artistic than factual most of the time.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, if I could just jump in. I mean, I think that's a really good and interesting point, like really important to remember.
Yeah.
But there's also the interesting thing that there's certain kinds, maybe say certain kinds of data that we take to be more factual or more transparent than others. And so in this case, that was one of the things that I had to struggle with, because this diabetic data, which is just numbers, blood sugar numbers extracted from my blood testing, is kind of the data that I live my life by. And it's like, it's necessary data to determine, you know, what I'm going to do with, if I'll eat something or inject insulin on the one hand. So like, I'm always struggling with, well, so this data,
life or death.
Yeah. And it means something in that context, but then on the other hand, to reduce it to, or kind of just think that because of that, it is completely transparent and doesn't have any biases or particular orientations, also seems really problematic. So yeah, but it's an interesting tension.
Well, I also think that there's degrees of interpreting data.
Yeah.
Whether you're coming from it at from a scientific perspective or a scientific application approach versus artistic application approach and perspective. So like the degrees of interpretation matter, and maybe the kind of transparency of showing that those degrees gives the viewer kind of a sense of the approach that the person that applied the data was coming at, essentially.
Maybe I can add in here. I think that there's something really interesting that all our papers kind of reference H.E.A.R.T, and in many ways this idea of what is the what we were working on. I think there's some value in the obfuscation of that data, or deliberately not worrying much about the accuracy of the data in some ways, in terms of how you kind of shift the context within which people discover it. So, you know, Barad talks a lot about the apparatuses of research, like whatever the lens that you use to look at data, for example, will kind of completely shift the way you interpret and understand that. And I think there's something really lovely in Samuel's work in the idea of, yes, this is the accuracy of the data is very important on a day-to-day basis, but there's also your agency in deciding to shift that and create a different cultural value that's drawn out the personal and public, which I think again that goes back to Barad.
Yeah, sure. Are you going to act on the data or not? That was one question for you, Aisling, is that I was thinking all of these kind of, you know, health monitors, Fitbit, Nike Plus, Runkeeper, these things, do they actually encourage us or do they hinder us because they're trying to get us to be more active, but in a way they're almost too forceful, I guess, in that way too.
Yeah, like the work that I presented is actually part of a much bigger project with 2 other women about creating design memoirs, and actually originated from a random conversation at a conference where this is a woman I just met said to me, God, I'm so angry all the time. Like, this is like in our Trumpian world that we live in here. And we began to just think a little bit about the idea that all this data collection that, especially we were all 3 of us are mothers, are just being told, and I know Samuel also mentioned Laura Forlano, but we were really taken with the idea that like of women having broken bodies and that technology would fix that for us. If only we had more data, we could do that. And the kind of pressure that puts on people that like, you're not good enough, like the Jawbone kind of talks about allowing you to be more, which assumes that you're kind of less. So I think that's where we were coming from. It's like these additional pressures that are put on you, and especially as parents, like if you're not doing this, you're careless or reckless. And you're like, okay, so maybe I should buy the thing, but where is the value proposition to you in that? So I think there's kind of these tensions that we were trying to draw out in this larger body of work. And by using the metaphor, we're making memoirs. We're not, you know, we're taking this data and we'll interpret it, this life experience, in a way that makes sense to us and has pretty much no like financial value to the tracking entities that we were using.
Yeah, I think that dynamic changes a lot when it becomes like a communication device. Like there was a project called the Kick Bee, which was a strap like a pregnant woman would wear that when the baby kicked, it would send a text message out to the husband to say that, you know, there was some kind of movement, which is kind of interesting. Question also came in on the chat for Renata from Mazbin Haq. Renata, what is your opinion on curating as a methodology for creating memories of the future? Big question.
Big question. Curating as creating memories for the future.
Is that possible?
For sure. I mean, I think that any artistic practice is a way of collecting memories for the future of, I don't know, like as André Malraux would say, of not buying art. Art is that which resists death, right? So what can resist, what can remain? So I think that any artistic practice is a way of producing memories that will last for the future. And I think that the question would be, is curating an artistic practice? I don't think there's any consensus on that. And some authors think it is, some others think it isn't. And I don't think, as I say also in the paper, in the presentation, I don't think it's a question of competition or of the creator of curating to be one to occupy the place that artistic practice occupies. But if we envisage curating as a creative practice, I think that its role is to to create shifts, to change perceptions, to change the way things are done and seen, and sometimes changing artworks. So yeah, I think it's more of a relation than anything else. But to answer the question as I can right now. I think yes,
Yeah.
it can.
Possible.
I think
Cool.
that,
No, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just hearing about how the other artists were talking about how their use of biodata is something about monitoring. I think something that I want to point out is that through the gamification of these biosignals, I mean, I think that there's this assumed kind of like innocent surveillance idea of emotion monitoring, but the game actually, Project H.E.A.R.T actually invites you to manipulate your emotions in order to perform for a certain way. And so that kind of creates like this psychopathic, in a way, like, you know, like this, this moment where you're kind of like, do I really feel this way? Is this sincere? And I think I mean, the monitoring of biodata, I think that there's this interesting thing there where as soon as it becomes monitored, then you alter your behavior and you're not doing what is natural. And so I guess I like the idea of instrumentalizing emotion or having this like fake sincere emotion. So just riffing on that.
Well, just following up on that, I was wondering as well from you guys why you think this type of interface has not been mainstreamed yet, or has not been mainstream, and what are the Xbox adaptive controller, for instance, which is something that's trying to go that direction.
Alex, do you want to talk about why you think this hasn't been mainstreamed?
Well, I mean, there was a few attempts, the Xbox being one of them, but I think the challenge is there's you know, the kind of technology and application with this in its simplest form with the controller does become problematic, especially when you're introducing monitoring of your kind of bodily kind of energy emissions, you know, heart rate, galvanic skin response, privacy issues, does it get recorded? And it goes back to commodification again. You know, that data can become commodified. And so I could see how from even the developer's side that they're aware of that and aware of the pushback that would ensue.
I'd like to add that it's also really hard.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, totally.
I haven't
good reading or something. Yeah.
I haven't seen, like, I've seen a few Kickstarters for emotion integrated games, and I noticed that it's also like Project H.E.A.R.T is really like quote unquote dumb. Like, we're not doing anything like emotionally nuanced here. We are literally capturing quote unquote enthusiasm is the word we use, because we keep it super vague. Because as it turns out, everyone's bodily reactions to fear and anger are actually very nuanced and personal, and it would be very difficult to instrumentalize these things without gathering some kind of a personal profile. So a lot of the bio games that you see are really super base level, usually skin conductance related stuff. And so, I mean, we didn't break the mold here. We were just like, the clever thing is the way that it's put in the game. But I've seen games that just kind of use startle responses, like, you know, like horror games, and then just relaxation apps. So, I mean, I think that the hardware is also, I mean, it can be produced cheaply, but respiration tracking is super difficult for a consumer. As it turns out, a lot of these things are kind of meaningless outside of a lab environment. So there's a lot of challenges. It's complicated.
I think something that strikes me as interesting there, Erin, is this idea that the kind of limits you're identifying to the technology are exactly what make it so interesting in the way that you've used it for the game, because it raises these questions around emotions and like hacking or like faking emotions, or just kind of the relationship between emotions and physiological reactions, which is super fascinating in the context of your game. But then I can see how for game designers more broadly, it becomes like hugely problematic, because there could be that frustration for a game player of like, well, I was actually really happy about that, but it thought I was pissed off. And,
yeah. That could be a fun, like the psychopathy game. try to convince our technology you feel some way.
Yeah.
And I think
are you guys familiar? Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Sorry. I think that the difference that Erin and Alex proposed between artificial and natural and what is sincere or not, it gets so, does it matter in the end? That's my question for you. Like, would it change if the enthusiasm is fake? I mean, that's, how can you even tell, you know, how could you even tell if it's fake or not?
How do we define what is sincerity? Yeah.
So in the end, I mean, it's a question that doesn't even matter a lot, right? Yeah. It's a
I mean, I've tried to test my sensors sometimes by like generating enthusiasm, and like, man, it's nothing but fails all around. I mean, I'm trying my best to be excited, and the technology doesn't see it. Really frustrating in those moments. So, I mean, I kind of feel, I don't know, but then in these moments of like, it's almost like when you think too hard about who you are as a person, you just kind of melt, because suddenly you're like, wait, am I feeling nervous? Is this anxiety? Is this excitement? You don't know. You just die inside and all the emotion goes away.
Well, I was going to say that there's a, yeah, go ahead, Aaron.
But also from like what I've seen from users of the experience, like the people that played through it, there is this kind of questioning for a while. Am I doing this right? Is it working?
Sure.
And then that flutter of the musical notes coming out of her body, which is the indicator that the threshold has been passed. So that's that kind of moment where they realize, oh, this is working. Like it's actually reading something that I'm trying to imbue into this virtual character. So that kind of moment of like, oh wow, it's working, and I see musical notes coming out of her body is a lovely moment.
Yeah, of success.
I'm succeeding at slaughtering people in an unjust war.
Yeah.
Great. Island, I have a question about, like, because something like, you know, Project H.E.A.R.T is a collaboration. It's like, you know, I have my own practice. Alex has his own practice. I'm trying to point at him. It's not working. And I guess that's something that I'm interested in, is like this question of like how I bring feminist ideas to the way that I treat biodata. And I don't know if like how important this is to you, or like if you feel that the way that you treat things are inspired by feminism. I mean, just because you are a woman, I don't want to presume these things. So like, I guess I'm just curious what your relationship to these ideas are.
No, sure. I mean, I think one thing that's interesting, like I'm actually a computer science professor. So even within my own department, they're like, what is she doing? Making metals. And that makes no sense. But yes, I think we've written quite a lot, myself and my other collaborators, about taking a feminist lens to this and really looking within human-computer interaction research as well, to looking at this idea of intimate design and kind of like intimate research as well, and bringing the personal to the fore in a form of autoethnography. So looking at it from a feminist point of view is important to us, but I think most recently we've written about our work using queer theory, and in particular this type of idea of low theory. So the idea of why do we have to talk about it in this like kind of high academic way, and whether or not using low theory, which is more like talking about it in a different vernacular in some ways, or talking about failure, or actually talking about it in a highly emotional way, is a little bit uncomfortable for people in an engineering field, where they're just like, why are you talking about your feelings? And you're bringing all these other kind of value propositions that are like not like normal, or they're not correctly measured. Like, I know, right? Because I'm just telling you what it is. And they're like, this is like poetry. I'm like, sure, if you think it's poetry, that's fine, but it's part of my praxis. And so I think initially we had written this really long journal article about this as like motherhood is like a wicked problem, like from a design perspective. And then we threw that out completely and we're like, no, it is helpful to bring in this critical feminist lens to it, and then other forms of theorizing around it. And I think for ISEA, we just wanted to talk about the thing, like this, and connected to the topics and themes of the conference. And so really kind of just wanted to focus on the mattering aspect. But we have written about it, and this type of work, this kind of critique of solutionism and quantification and the idea of being more within the context of women's health. And that's kind of where our longer kind of exposition on this has really kind of looked at. Three of us created these different types of design memoirs and then used Barad's method actually of diffractive reading to read them against one another. So that's, and this is kind of part of an ongoing project. But yes, I mean, it's this way that I, in my practice as a so-called engineer, try and bring that feminist theory in and this way of making as my kind of response to data. And that's, I guess that's a very long-winded answer to your question.
Thank you.
Yeah, actually, just on that, because it's such a personal item and you wear it, I was wondering, like, what are people's reactions to it? Are they freaked out by it, or are they like, does it bring up just a conversation immediately about the reasoning behind it?
I think, I mean, sometimes I just wear it in my, it was part of, again, with this project, my other colleague did a piece on pockets. So we talked about, I would wear it in my pocket. And the thing that's quite interesting is, especially for my colleagues who are engineers, they were just like, oh, okay, how did you make it? And so that's all they wanted to talk about. They're like, oh, that's women's stuff. But what machine did you use? And I did a collaboration with my colleagues in mechanical engineering, because they have these really cool additive manufacturing machines that are multi-jet technology, so you can simultaneously print in different materials and colors. So these are like $1 million machines, and I learned how to use it myself and kind of manufactured it, where you can, you know, create internal and external and emboss things. So that, I think, was one way that is like a safe thing to discuss for those who are very uncomfortable with the idea of, you know, talking about IVF or bringing, I mean, we talked a little bit as well about bringing the personal into a professional setting and being like, this is actually how I want to talk about this type of work. Particularly because in my work setting, when I was going through this process, one of my bosses, like my head of my department, just straight out asked me if I had cancer. You know, because I was constantly, and I never told him I was going to the hospital. I was just like, I have to go very early in the morning. I go at 5 a.m. I'll be back at 8. And they just assumed that. I'm like, nope, but it's not something I want to discuss with you. But then I made the medal. And then I was like, I will discuss it in a framework that is the way I want to talk about it. But there is a kind of a risk as an academic to bringing the personal into, like I said, professional settings. Where it seems safe for me to come to ISEA to do it, but a little odd to put it in a computer science journal.
I have a question to complement that, because infertility has been vaguely absent from feminist art throughout art history and art in general. And I worked with an artist, H.E.A.R.T, here in Montreal, who has a work with made a sound work with infertility, that she actually recorded all the medication that she took on a daily basis in kind of a journal format. And this was the audio piece that we exhibited. And I was wondering, because you said, I was wondering if in your practice, you feel the need, you want to wear the medal to create a conversation about infertility, or it's just like a kind of totally intimate, personal choice for you? Because for her, there was this desire of, let's talk about it. Let's talk about it out loud.
Yeah, I mean, I think we kind of struggled a little bit with that back and forth. And actually, there is a fertility art festival that's held in London. It has been running since 2019, which is really interesting in terms of getting people to come. And those who do want to have those public conversations can engage there. For myself and my colleagues that I worked on with these, I think initially, I mean, I thought like I don't know if I really want to wear it, but that's why I used the example from the Pinterest thing. It's more like, this is something that I want to put in a domestic setting for myself and to hold on to it. And my older children were, you know, we could kind of talk about it. They were very curious about it, about what this thing was that I was keeping beside my bedside table. So in some ways, it's more for me as a form of reclaiming that on a personal basis. But rather than, I don't really want to have necessarily public conversations with strangers, but we've created these papers. And by talking about it in a context where I know the audience will be somewhat receptive to it, and maybe we'll try and get at different aspects of it, rather than having to be like, now I have this, you know, talisman that I can use to get people to discuss it. And one thing that I was really curious about when we were working on this is on Etsy, for example, there are all these types of jewelry that you can purchase that memorialize different aspects of this process, which I felt really kind of intriguing in some ways, the idea that that is the conversation piece and you purchase it and wear it, and it becomes this big part of your identity. And I don't think that's what we were getting at, but it's, to me, it was about looking in and using the kind of the theoretical papers as a way to forge a conversation.
Also, I had a question sort of related to a little bit of that, but it's for Renata, about curation. As an artist myself, being in shows, I was just wondering, when you were talking about how sometimes curation often changes the art, in a way, changes the artworks. And I was wondering, is there a tension between curators and artists in the way that art is positioned in public exhibitions, where maybe the theme might not actually connect that, but it's still in the exhibition? And how does the artist feel?
I think so. I think there's it's unfortunately, it's something that happens a lot. I think that when we're talking about new media art, it tends to happen less because it's a more collaborative, and I mean, the tendency for the whole show to be very discussed with between curators and artists beforehand is much greater. And I also think that artists are more open to curatorial ideas, to ideas from curators than they normally would be, in terms of like how to install the works, how to present the works, how to include the visitor in what's being shown. But I think that it has been it can be, if it is hierarchical in any way, like the curator as being the selector, which is the basic definition of the word that is being, I don't know, like this is a very outdated vision. And I think that what is good when we talk about new media practices is that the tendency to collaboration and to present open works and to integrate many parts of the process into the work can prevent this from happening more regularly than, let's say, in traditional media.
Thank you. Yeah, great. I don't see any other questions coming in from the discussion. Does anyone here have another question for each other? Before we close?
Well, in terms of sentience, I'm curious,
okay,
Renata, where does complexity come in? Because I think also there are degrees of sentience, like depending on complexity. Like cells have, in my opinion, sentience because they're like photosynthetic cells have like a reactive capability to be sensitive to light. But in terms of like the kind of higher order beings, like more complex beings, like yeah, when it gets back to the curatorial agency and the kind of curatorial side of sentient beings like ourselves, there's a kind of difference there. But I was just curious as to your thoughts on complexity.
Mm-hmm. Complexity of beings, of artworks, of
both of beings and
yeah.
Like also like this complexity of artworks, is there degrees of that as well?
I think that complexity is super subjective too. I mean, what we consider as complex or not. But as a curator, I'm always thinking about the audience, right? Because the audience sometimes considers, has a hard time understanding what, all of you talked about the importance of engaging with the artwork and of creating meaning and of interpreting at the end. The creation of meaning was something that came out on all your presentations. And I think that curatorial work has also that compromise, that engagement to create this bridge between what the artist is trying to do and the capability of the audience to access that without instrumentalizing it. I know that sometimes instrumentalization is interesting for artists, but what I think is important is to always leave room for original and creative interpretation and agency. I mean, from the part of the public, of the audience. But in terms of exhibiting highly complex works, I would be curious to know, for instance, Sam's experience with presenting this work. If you had any thought about how to if you had any difficulties or what the challenges were to translate all of this to the audience that was there, and how to create and how to manipulate the artifacts and everything.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, it was a difficult process in some ways. I mean, there had to be a bit of text to kind of guide people through it somewhat. And I mean, ideally, I like works where there doesn't need to be a text necessarily, but in this case, there did have to be something. And then there are just some kind of technical, practical matters that made it a bit more difficult, to like the fact that the devices that people interacted with while they were watching the video had cords, and so they're interacting with at least two devices while watching a video, but both these devices have cords, but they're supposed to kind of wear them in some way. So there were multiple registers of, I guess, complexity that I don't feel like I found like the perfect way to exhibit it yet. I mean, when I've done it in kind of more casual or workshop settings, that actually goes a bit better because it still is kind of a work in progress. But yeah, it's a good point.
Can I ask you a follow-up question to that, Sam? Because when you say when you're talking about it being a work in progress, that's what was really interesting. Like, is this something that's kind of, it's a life's work, right? That this is something that will be with you for, this is part of who you are. And so I was curious when we talked earlier, I think Erin brought up the point about monitoring it as being maybe that it's not kind of part of your normal everyday experience, but for you, the normal is the monitoring because it's essential. And I was curious if you look at people like Steve Mann's work on this idea of surveillance and getting, a whole variety of people who are interested in that idea of the continuous sensing and monitoring. And some people do it just as a form of data collection. Others, for you, I think you have this level of interpretation in it. So I'm curious where you see this going, or is it always going to be a work in progress?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think, there are a couple of things there. I think it will always be a work in progress. And I think that, it is normal for me to always be monitoring my blood glucose. But what's different is the attention I give to monitoring. So when I knew that I was going to do something with it artistically in an artistic context, it really changed actually my monitoring practices. So I was a lot more, in a way, ironically, I was a better patient than I would have been, because I knew I was going to do something with this data. And so I was really careful at least in collecting it. And then on the flip side, there was kind of this perverse fascination with, well, what if I run my blood sugar a bit higher, like to get a different result? I mean, I didn't really do that too much, but, and then there's different ways I've been experimenting with tracking. So now I'm like doing an audio recording every time I test my blood sugar. And so then that really changes the monitoring practice too, because it's like I'll have these little 10 to 20 second clips of some intimate part of my life. It could, like, I could be talking about something with my partner or whatever, and it just ends up on there. But it creates a different relationship to that continuous monitoring. Yeah.
Good point. Another question came up in the discussion. It was for Erin and Alex. Alex and Erin, did you just figure out how to perform the appropriate emotional performance? I'm not exactly sure that means. It must have something to do with psychopathy game needs.
Right.
Did you see that discussion?
Let me go take a look.
Yeah, it says, interesting that Erin still has to mention this idea of mapping as expressive, where we are on public discourse around computation. Where are we on public discourse around computation? That's from Ben Bogart.
I don't know why, but I don't have this question. So can you just repeat it once more? It's a really interesting question. I want to make sure I get it right.
Oh, just wondering why you guys have to mention this idea of mapping as expressive. Where are we on public discourse around computation? Probably related to emotional performance.
Well, I mean, like, I can speak about my own interest in computation and emotion. Is that, like, I think that there's one thing to talk about it as a mapping and expression practice, but I think that earlier in my career, I was really interested in mapping and representing and kind of like allowing the mapping to be something that brings somebody closer empathetically to another person. I now see this as kind of like, I mean, a lot of art does this anyways, this production of empathy. Is this the real goal? But what I'm really interested actually now in exploring, like on the topic of ISEA and sentience, how I can connect this emotional indeterminate data that connects bodies and social context very concretely to algorithms, and interact, like kind of having what I call like a embodied algorithmicity, because I'm interested in the idea of like incorporating the human, incorporating their body literally into a kind of system. And so getting people to play along and manipulate their emotional state as a way of being involved in this algorithm is something that I find really interesting and something that I want to like move forward more so than mapping. But I think it's the mapping that got me there, because I think I kind of felt like I had exhausted what mapping could be. So now I kind of like using the mapping as a means of producing something other, and like really focusing on the social context and like bodies talking to each other or body talking to algorithm.
Great. Definitely think that answers the question. I think we're out of time, right? It's 11:45. Oh. Thank you guys, I guess. I think we have to end. I mean, maybe there's time. Is there time for one more? I don't know. The head of this is running things, but I think looks like we're out of time. So thank you guys on amazing presentations. Really interesting discussion for sure after that. And let's see. Yeah, I guess we can follow it up in the discussions afterwards. But yeah,
thank you everyone. Thanks. Really nice to.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks.
Yeah,
no problem.